Okay, so now we are finally moving on to evaluating arguments. Up until now, for the first 4 steps, we've been focusing all of our energy on understanding the structure of the arguments as expressed by the author, just trying to figure out what claims the author is using and how those claims relate to each other. Now we are starting to evaluate the premises of those arguments. And we're going to start with acceptability. Now I'm on example number 2, which turned out to be a little bit more complicated than we originally thought. So we have, 19 premises, 18 premises. So we're going to need some room. I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller, a little wider so it takes up less space. I'm going to make a really big text box. This whole diagram just a tad to the right to give me a little bit more space. I think I can do that by clicking on all the premises, though I'm not sure I grabbed 3 there. Good. There we go. Just move everything over. I can still see it. Gives me a little bit more space over here. Okay, I'm going to start down at the bottom. That's usually the way I like to do it. Start from the bottom and head up towards the top. Now, one thing that's a little strange about acceptability is that one of the ways in which a premise can be deemed acceptable is if it has a strong subargument. But I'm not in a position to evaluate whether a subargument is strong or not. Remember, there's going to be 3 criteria that we're going to use, and this is only the first one. So I have to kind of ignore the subarguments and just evaluate the premises on their own. Okay. And when I'm looking at this particular example, I'm assuming that I'm listening to someone who's observing something about a person. So there's going to be a lot of personal testimony. So premise number 14 down here. I'm going to say that's acceptable. This claim is based on the speaker's personal testimony, and I trust that the speaker is sufficiently reliable that I can accept the speaker's observations. Now, this is not 100% foolproof, right? I mean, this person who's speaking, this is very much out of context. This person may be a pathological liar, may have something wrong with their perception such that I shouldn't trust what their perception is. But from everything I know, if the person is saying her coat still hasn't dried, I can accept that based on their personal testimony. Let's go right across here and do 10. 10. The person was intending to stay overnight. Oh, actually, excuse me. Let me do 11 because actually in terms of the levels of the argument, a level is first. Same thing as the evaluation above. In fact, it's so similar, and this is not that unusual, that I'm going to copy it and paste it right in there. Right? This claim is also based on the person's observations, on their personal testimony. So I accept it for the very same reason that I accepted the claim number 14. Okay, so that seems to be the same level. Now let's go to 10. Notice that even though the premises are numbered, I don't have to evaluate them in order. That's really irrelevant. The numbers are just so that when someone else is looking at my diagram, I can see which premise they are evaluating. So 10, the person was intending to stay overnight. So here's a good example. There's some evidence that she was intending to stay overnight, but I have to sort of ignore that evidence right now. Eventually I'll be able to look at it, but right now I have to ignore it. So I'm going to say provisionally acceptable. The reasons I'm not saying this is acceptable is because this claim is not something like an observation, which is the other ones that I have evaluated so far. The author has some reason to make this claim, but I am not in a position to evaluate the evidence that the author is relying on. I would need to do so before accepting this claim, but it does seem reasonable at first glance. Okay? All right, now let's go up over here to the person's coat is slightly damp. Same thing as 14 and 11. This is an observation, and I can trust this person, as far as I know, to make reliable observations. Let's go to 5. Same thing again. Okay, there's dampness under her collar. That's something that this person is observing. 8, same thing again. So becoming clear to me that this argument really uses a lot of observation. So it's relying heavily on the accuracy of the person. Okay, let's go over here and go to this level of argumentation for 4. There's been no rain in London at that time. That's also an observation that I accept on the basis of personal testimony. So this person has observed something about London, and I see no reason to disagree with that. 3, the person has been in heavy rain in the last few hours. Now this is more like 10, right? Because there's some evidence for this, but I can't really evaluate the evidence, but it seems reasonable, so I'm going to call it provisionally acceptable. 13, very similar. There's some evidence. I'm not skilled enough to know whether this evidence is enough, but it seems reasonable, so I'm going to provisionally accept it. Same thing for 12. Now this is not unusual to find a certain pattern in an argument. Arguments can have multiple patterns, repeated patterns in them of the same kind of logic, of the same kind of evidence. They don't always. Sometimes they have very, very different kinds of evidence. But it's not that unusual to say, oh, this person is making the same kind of moves over and over again, the same kinds of claims that I'm going to evaluate in the same kinds of ways. 6, the same thing. Now this is important. Look, the person has turned the coat collar up against the wind. I'm going to accept this provisionally because the author didn't see the person do that. The author is concluding that from some other observations. Same thing with 9. So a lot of provisionally acceptable claims here that I would probably evaluate differently if I had all 3 criteria under my belt that I'd be using. Okay, so I've gone all the way across here. Let's go up to 3. Same thing. The person's been in heavy rain. That isn't a direct observation. That's based on some evidence. So I'm going to provisionally accept that. And then up to 19. We're running out of space here. Let me see if I can move this. Just get us a little bit more space by going like this. Moving this up and making it just a tad wider. But I'll probably end up going up and down the screen a little bit by the end. That's fine too. So let's look at 19. It's an unstated premise, but remember that unstated premises are evaluated just like stated premises. No difference at all. Person traveled to London from somewhere else. Again, relying on evidence, other claims. In fact, at least 2 levels of subarguments that goes into here. So I'm going to provisionally accept that. And in fact, I notice if I go across here, look, 18 is going to be the same. 17 is going to be the same. 15 has no subarguments, so that might be a little different. 16 is going to be the same. So I'm going to have the same evaluations for 18, 17, and 16. Just going to scroll down a little bit here. 18, 17, and 16. That leaves me 15 to do. 15 has no subarguments. There's no evidence given for 15. Let's go back and remind ourselves what 15 says. Cardiff is the only place within 2 or 3 hours that has had heavy rain and strong wind. This is back to the ones that we were doing earlier, like up here. I'm sorry, not 10, more like 11. It's personal testimony, it's observations, it's personal knowledge. So I am still going to provisionally accept that. And the reason I went provisionally acceptable rather than acceptable is that this is not a claim that could be based purely on personal observation. I might have just said that, if so I was wrong, because there's no way you could observe yourself all of these places. You'd have to do some research. So this person must have done a little fact finding to discover that Cardiff is the only place within 2 or 3 hours that's had heavy rain and strong wind. So I would need to double check that research. So I'm going to change the language here. It's not exactly based on the personal testimony. It's more based on personal knowledge. And I would want to double check that knowledge before accepting it. Before accepting it outright. Now, notice, if I were differently situated, say I had been in London in this time period. I might have my own personal knowledge that could corroborate this claim or this claim. So different people differently situated could evaluate premises in different ways, and that's really quite appropriate. I have to come to any argument with whatever background knowledge I have with my own situation from my own location and do the best I can. Okay? So I have done every single premise, taken them all individually, even though I saw some patterns, and made the best judgments I could. So that's a good example of step 5.